Hello, and welcome to the World War Lab channel. Today's story takes us high above occupied Europe, into freezing air, roaring engines, and a moment where survival depended on a single man at the very back of a bomber. At 11:32 on the morning of November 29, 1943, Staff Sergeant Eugene Moran knelt in the tail section of a B-17 flying fortress nicknamed Rikki Tikki Tavi, watching German fighters surge toward his bomber like enraged hornets. He was only 19 years old, a farm kid from rural Wisconsin, flying his very first combat mission over one of the most heavily defended targets in Germany. That morning, the 8th Air Force had dispatched more than 300 heavy bombers to smash the industrial factories of Bremen. Within the first hour alone, German defenders had already shot down 6 flying fortresses. Morris's position was the most isolated on the entire aircraft. The tail gunner sat on a bicycle-style seat at the extreme rear of the bomber, separated from the rest of the crew by nearly 40 feet of narrow fuselage. His only companions were a pair of .50 caliber machine guns and the enemy pilots trying to kill him. The B-17 carried 10 men in total, pilot and co-pilot in the cockpit, navigator and bombardier in the nose, flight engineer manning the top turret, the radio operator stationed behind the bomb bay, 2 waist gunners standing at open side windows, the ball turret gunner suspended beneath the aircraft inside a fragile glass sphere, and Morris alone in the tail. The tail gunner's job was brutally simple: protect the bomber's most vulnerable angle. German pilots had learned early in the war that attacking directly from behind a B-17 placed in the firing arc of only one defender, the man in the tail. By November 1943, the 8th Air Force was losing bombers at a catastrophic pace. The infamous Schweinfurt mission 2 months earlier had cost 60 flying fortresses in a single day, 600 men killed or captured in one afternoon. Bomber crews grimly referred to deep missions into Germany as milk runs to hell. The math of survival offered little comfort. A bomber crew needed to complete 25 missions to earn a ticket home, yet statistical studies showed the average crew survived only 15. Some bomb groups were losing half their aircraft every single month. Morris had enlisted the day he turned 18. Having grown up on a dairy farm near Soldiers Grove, Wisconsin, he used to watch airplanes pass overhead and dreamed of flying one himself. But the Army Air Forces desperately needed gunners, young men with sharp reflexes, steady hands, and nerves of steel, farm boys who already knew how to shoot. Gunnery training taught Morris how to track fast-moving targets while compensating for wind, altitude, and the speed of his own aircraft. He learned to fire in short, control bursts to keep his barrels from overheating. He memorized the silhouettes of enemy fighters, the Messerschmitt Bf 109, the Focke-Wulf 190, and could identify them from 2,000 yards away. But no amount of training could truly prepare anyone for combat over Germany. At 24,000 feet, the temperature plunged to 40 degrees below zero. Frostbite stole fingers and toes. The thin air made even the smallest movement exhausting, and the German fighters came in relentless waves, firing 20mm cannons that could rip through aluminum skin like paper. Rikki Tikki Tavi had lifted off from Snetterton Heath in England that morning as part of the 96th Bomb Group. Their target was Bremen, a vital industrial city on the Weser River, home to shipyards, aircraft factories, submarine pens, and some of the densest air defenses in the Reich. The bomber formations crossed the North Sea packed into tight defensive boxes, each B-17 positioned to provide overlapping fields of fire. The theory was straightforward: fly close together so the combined firepower could drive enemy fighters away. The reality was far harsher. A direct hit on one aircraft often damaged those flying beside it. As the formations neared Bremen, German anti-aircraft guns opened fire. Black bursts of flak erupted across the sky. The bombers could not maneuver. They had to fly straight and level during the bomb run. Shrapnel tore through wings and fuselages. From his tail position, Morris watched a B-17 ahead of them take a direct hit. The aircraft folded in half and dropped away, vanishing into the clouds below. Moments later, Rikki Tikki Tavi released its bomb load, for 1,000 pounds of high explosives tumbling toward the factories beneath. The mission was complete. Now they only had to survive the journey home. If you want to see how Morris's mission ultimately turned out, hit the like button. It helps us share more forgotten stories like this one. Subscribe if you haven't already. Now back to Morris. The bomber formation began its turn back toward England. Nearly 200 miles of hostile airspace still lay between them and safety. That was when Rikki Tikki Tavi's number 2 engine took a direct hit from Flak. The propeller began to windmill uselessly, and the aircraft immediately started losing speed. A damaged bomber falling behind the formation was effectively a death sentence. German fighter pilots watched closely for stragglers. A lone B-17, stripped of protection provided by mass defensive fire, was easy prey. Morris saw them coming. A dozen Messerschmitts climbing up from below. Another group of Focke-Wulfs diving down from above. Rikki Tikki Tavi was about to fight alone against overwhelming odds. And from his position in the tail, Eugene Morris would be their first target. The first Messerschmitts attacked from the 6 o'clock low position, directly behind and beneath the bomber. Morris pressed his shoulders hard against the steel armor plate behind him and squeezed the triggers. His twin .50 caliber machine guns thundered to life. Streams of tracer rounds stitched the air toward the oncoming fighter. The German pilot broke off at the last second, rolling away to escape the fire. But there were more, many more. The attackers hunted in pairs. One fighter would draw the gunner's attention, while the second lined up a killing shot. Morris swung his guns from target to target, firing in controlled bursts. Spent brass casings piled around his knees, clattering across the floor. The sharp smell of cordite filled the cramped compartment. At 24,000 feet, the temperature inside Rikki Tikki Tavi hovered at 43 degrees below zero. Morris wore an electrically heated flight suit, but the cold still crept in. His breath froze into tiny ice crystals on his oxygen mask. The machine guns grew scorching hot from near-constant firing, while his fingers slowly went numb inside his thick gloves. The German pilots were seasoned professionals, Luftwaffe veterans who had been fighting since 1939. They knew exactly how to kill a B-17. First, cripple the engine so the bomber couldn't keep up. Then pick off the gunners to silence the defensive fire. Finally, pour cannon rounds into fuselage until something vital failed. Morris heard the impacts before he felt them. 20-millimeter shells punched through the aluminum skin with the sound of tearing metal. Somewhere forward in the aircraft, one of the waist gunners stopped firing. Then the other fell silent. The intercom crackled with static and fragments of voices, overlapping and distorted. Morris couldn't tell who was speaking or what they were saying. The bomber shuddered again as more rounds slammed home. He kept firing. There was nothing else he could do. A Focke-Wulf swept in from the 4 o'clock position. Morris swung his guns, centered the sights, and pressed the triggers. The fighter's wing exploded into fragments. The aircraft spun downward, trailing a thick ribbon of black smoke. It was his first, confirmed kill. There was no time to celebrate. Cannon rounds tore through the tail section, and Moran felt a violent impact slam into his left forearm, then another into his right. Both arms had been hit. Blood immediately soaked through the sleeves of his flight suit. The pain was sharp and overwhelming, but his hand still functioned. He could still close his fingers. He could still squeeze the triggers. More rounds struck the aircraft. The vertical stabilizer above him absorbed multiple hits. Control cables snapped loose and whipped through the air like steel snakes. The entire tail section began to vibrate violently. Something was terribly wrong. Moran glanced down at his parachute, the standard silk canopy packed into a canvas container strapped to his chest. Every airman wore one. If the bomber went down, it was his only chance to live. He saw the damage instantly. Holes, several of them. Cannon shells had shredded the fabric. His parachute was useless. If he had to bail out, he would fall 4 miles straight to his death. The attack did not let up. German fighters came again and again, methodical and relentless. Moran counted at least 15 aircraft circling the crippled bomber. Rikki Tikki Tavi was bleeding both altitude and airspeed. The remaining engines screamed as they struggled to keep the aircraft in the sky. Forward in the nose section, Navigator Jesse Orson was still alive. He had been wounded but remained conscious. The pilot and co-pilot were both dead at the controls. The flight engineer lay lifeless in his turret. The radio operator was dead. The ball turret gunner was dead. The waist gunners were dead. Of the 10 men who had taken off from England that morning, only 2 were still breathing. Orson in the nose, Moran in the tail. 40 feet of shattered fuselage separated them. Then another cannon round struck the bomber, hitting something vital. Moran felt the aircraft lurch violently. A grinding vibration echoed through the airframe, growing stronger until his teeth rattled in his skull. And then came a sound he would remember for the rest of his life. The shriek of tearing aluminum, the scream of structural failure. Rikki Tikki Tavi was coming apart. The fuselage split just forward the tail. Moran watched in disbelief as the front of the aircraft separated and fell away. The wings, the engines, the cockpit, and the bodies of his crewmates all tumbled downward toward the German countryside for miles below. In an instant, he was alone. Trapped inside a severed tail section, wounded in both arms, his parachute destroyed, 24,000 feet above enemy territory, falling. Physics offered no mercy. Terminal velocity for a human body was roughly 120 miles per hour. The tail section of a B-17 weighed several thousand pounds. It would fall faster, much faster. Eugene Moran had perhaps 90 seconds left to live. The detached tail section tumbled through the sky, spinning end over end. Moran was thrown violently against the walls of his compartment. His wounded arms screamed in agony. Blood sprayed across the interior. Wind howled through the open tear where the rest of the aircraft had been. He should have been paralyzed with fear. He should have curled into a ball and waited for the inevitable. Instead, he did something that defied logic. He kept fighting. The German fighters were still circling overhead. They saw the tail section falling and moved in closer. Perhaps they wanted to confirm the kill. Perhaps they were simply curious. Whatever the reason, they made a fatal mistake. They flew within range of a wounded tail gunner who refused to die. Moran grabbed his machine guns. The spinning wreckage made aiming almost impossible. G-forces crushed him into his seat, then hurled him upward toward the ceiling. His arms were shattered. His parachute was gone. He was falling 4 miles to certain death, and he was still shooting. Tracer rounds arced wildly through the sky as the tail section rotated. The German pilots scattered in confusion. They had never seen anything like it. A man inside a falling coffin firing back with everything he had left. One Messerschmitt took multiple hits across its fuselage. The pilot broke off and dove toward the ground, trailing smoke. The altimeter in the tail section had shattered, but Moran could see the earth rushing closer through the gaps in the torn metal. Fields, forest roads, a patchwork of German farmland rising to meet him. And then something extraordinary happened. The aerodynamics of the tail section began to work in his favor. The vertical and horizontal stabilizers acted like crude wings, catching the air and creating drag. Instead of plunging straight down, the wreckage began to glide. The violent spinning slowed. The descent became almost controlled. Almost. Moran estimated he was falling at roughly 100 feet per second. Still fast enough to kill him on impact, but slower than a human body in free fall. The stabilizers were buying him time. Seconds, maybe a minute. He used every one of them to fire at any German fighter that came too close. The ground was 5,000 feet below, then 3,000, then 1,000. Moran braced himself against the steel chest plate. He wrapped his shattered arms around the ammunition boxes. There was nothing else to hold on to. The tail section struck the top of a pine tree at nearly 100 miles per hour. Branches as thick as a man's arm snapped instantly. The vertical stabilizer caught on a trunk and tore away. The wreckage cartwheeled to the forest canopy, shedding twisted aluminum with every impact. Moran's head slammed into the steel framework above him. His vision exploded into white light. He felt his ribs crack. Both arms bent at angles they were never meant to bend. The tail section hit another tree, spun sideways, and slammed into the frozen ground. Then there was silence. Eugene Moran was alive. Barely. He lay in the wreckage, unable to move. Both forearms were broken in multiple places, compound fractures with bone protruding through torn skin. His ribs were shattered. Every breath sent knives of pain through his chest. Blood poured from a head wound where a piece of his skull had been torn away, leaving part of his brain exposed to the freezing air. The crash site lay in a forest near the German town of Psyche, 15 miles south of Bremen, deep in enemy territory. Moran was surrounded by people who had just watched American bombs destroy their factories and kill their neighbors. He tried to move. His legs responded weakly. His arms were useless. The cold crept steadily into his body. If his wounds didn't kill him, hypothermia would. Within hours. First, Moran dragged himself toward the opening where the tail section had torn away from the rest of the aircraft. Every movement sent waves of agony through his shattered body. Inch by inch, he pulled himself onto frozen ground and lay there, staring up at the dull gray German sky. He had survived a 4-mile fall without a parachute, something only 3 men in the entire war would ever do. But survival meant nothing if he bled to death alone in a German forest. Voices echoed through the trees. German voices. Soldiers moving in to investigate the crash. They would find an American airman with catastrophic injuries, an enemy combatant, a bomber crewman who had just helped destroy their city. What they might do to him was impossible to know. German soldiers emerged from the trees with rifles raised. They surrounded the wreckage and stared down at the broken American lying in the snow. One shouted orders. Another ran back toward the road, likely to summon an officer. Moran could not resist. He could not fight. He could barely breathe. The soldiers searched him roughly, ignoring his cries of pain as they lifted and twisted his shattered arms. They found his dog tags, his rank insignia, his ruined parachute. Then they left him lying on the frozen ground while they inspected the wreckage. An officer arrived within the hour. He studied Moran's wounds and shook his head. The American was clearly dying. Moving him anywhere seemed pointless, but orders were orders. Downed airmen were to be captured and interrogated if possible. Dead airmen provided no intelligence. They loaded Moran onto a wooden cart. No stretcher, no blankets, no medical care. The cart rattled along frozen roads for what felt like hours. Every jolt sent fresh agony through his broken ribs and mangled arms. The wound in his skull had stopped bleeding, but only because the cold had frozen the blood into a dark, rigid crust. The cart delivered him to a German military facility of some kind. Moran could not tell what it was. His vision blurred. Consciousness came and went. He remembered being carried inside. He remembered lying on a concrete floor. He remembered German voices discussing him as if he were already dead. No doctor came. No medic. No water. No bandages. No morphine. Medical supplies were scarce, and the Germans were not going to waste them on an enemy airman who would likely die anyway. Moran lay on that concrete floor for 2 days. His wounds became infected. The exposed tissue of his brain began to swell. His broken arms turned dark purple and black. Gangrene was setting in. Without surgery, he would lose both limbs. Without antibiotics, the infection would spread through his bloodstream. Without intervention, he had perhaps 48 hours left to live. The guards watched his condition deteriorate. Some seemed indifferent. Others looked almost sympathetic. But none had the authority or the resources to save him. American bombers had been leveling German cities for months. Doctors were overwhelmed. Supplies were rationed. Enemy airmen ranked far below German soldiers and civilians on the priority list. On the 3rd day, Moran was moved again. Another wooden cart. Another agonizing journey over frozen roads. This time, he was taken to a prisoner of war hospital, a converted building somewhere in occupied territory where wounded Allied airmen were held until they were strong enough to be sent to permanent camps. The hospital was understaffed and badly undersupplied. German military doctors practiced brutal triage. Prisoners with survivable wounds were treated. Those deemed beyond saving were left to die. Moran's injuries placed him squarely in the 2nd category. But the hospital held an unlikely secret. Among the prisoners were 2 Serbian doctors, military physicians captured on the Eastern Front. They had been forced into service, performing surgeries with inadequate equipment and almost no anesthesia. The Germans allowed this because it freed their own doctors for more important patients. The Serbian doctors examined Moran and made a decision. They would try to save him, not because they were ordered to, not because they had the proper tools or medicine, simply because he was a wounded man, and they were doctors. The surgery lasted 7 hours. They worked with crude instruments meant for battlefield emergencies. There was no proper anesthesia, only local numbing agents that barely dulled the pain. Moran drifted in and out of consciousness as they set his broken bones with metal pins and wire. They cut away infected tissue. They removed bone fragments from his skull and covered the exposed brain with whatever tissue they could salvage. One of the doctors fashioned a metal plate and secured it to Moran's head. Primitive by modern standards, but enough to keep him alive. They splinted his arms with wooden boards and wrapped him in bandages torn from bed sheets. They used everything they had. When the surgery was finished, they told him the truth. The next 72 hours would decide everything. His body had to defeat the remaining infection. His bones had to begin healing. His brain had to avoid swelling any further. There was nothing more they could do. Eugene Moran's survival now depended entirely on his own will. The fever came that first night. His temperature climbed to 104 degrees. His body shook with violent chills, even as sweat soaked the sheets beneath him. The Serbian doctors watched as closely as they could. They changed his bandages. They forced water between his cracked lips. They waited. Infection was a great killer in wartime hospitals. Antibiotics existed, but they were nearly impossible to obtain in a German prisoner facility. The doctors had cleaned Moran's wounds as thoroughly as possible, but bacteria had already entered his bloodstream. His immune system was fighting a war inside his own body. The second night was worse. Moran slipped into delirium. He called out for his mother. He shouted warnings to crewmates who were already dead. His mind replayed the moment when Rikki Tikki Tavi broke apart, again and again, trapped in a loop of terror. Other wounded prisoners in the ward listened to his ravings and wondered if he would live to see morning. The Serbian doctors took turns sitting beside him. They had no medicine to give, only their presence. Cold cloths pressed against his burning forehead. Quiet words of encouragement spoken in accented English that he likely never heard. On the third morning, the fever broke. Moran opened his eyes and, for the first time in days, recognized where he was. He was alive. The infection had not killed him. His body had won a battle that medicine could not fight. The doctors examined his wounds and saw the first signs of recovery. The tissue around the metal plate in his skull was beginning to close. The broken bones in his arms were starting to knit together. Recovery would take months, perhaps years. The damage to his body was severe and permanent, but against every expectation, against physics, against infection, against war itself, Eugene Moran was going to survive. Word spread quickly through the hospital. The American who had fallen 4 miles without a parachute, the tail gunner who kept firing as his bomber disintegrated around him, the man who should have died a dozen times but simply refused to stop breathing. German guards came by just to look at him. Other prisoners asked to hear his story. Even hospital administrators seemed quietly impressed by a survival that made no sense. The Serbian doctors had saved Moran's life, but they could not shield him forever. The hospital was only a temporary stop, a way station where broken men were stabilized just enough to be moved into the German prisoner system. Once Moran was strong enough to travel, he would be sent to a permanent camp. 6 weeks after the crash, Moran could walk again. His arms were still locked in splints. The metal plate in his skull caused constant pounding headaches. His ribs ached with every breath. But he was upright. He was conscious. He was deemed fit for transfer. The Germans processed him with code efficiency. Name, rank, serial number, branch of service, unit assignment. They photographed him for their files. A thin young man with hollow cheeks, bandaged arms, and eyes that looked far older than his 19 years. His first permanent camp was Stalag Luft 4 in Pomerania, a compound built specifically to hold captured Allied airmen. Barbed wire fences stretched in every direction. Guard towers with machine guns loomed overhead. Wooden barracks offered little protection from the brutal Eastern European winter. Thousands of American and British airmen filled the camp. Pilots, navigators, bombardiers, gunners. Some had been prisoners for years. Others had arrived only weeks earlier. All shared the same future: captivity until the war ended, or until they died. Inside the wire, Moran discovered a strange kind of order. The prisoners organized themselves into units. Military discipline was maintained as best it could be. Libraries were built from donated and scavenged books. Classes were held in mathematics, engineering, history, and foreign languages. Secret radios were constructed to listen to BBC broadcasts. Escape plans were whispered, drawn, and rehearsed, though few ever succeeded. Food was scarce. Thin soup, black bread, occasionally potatoes or turnips. Red Cross parcels helped when they arrived, but deliveries were unpredictable. Most prisoners lost 20 to 30 pounds during captivity. Some lost far more. Moran's body continued to heal. His arms regained function, though they would never recover their former strength. The headaches from his skull injury became less frequent, but never fully disappeared. The nightmares never stopped. He was alive. He was surviving. But 17 months of captivity still lay ahead of him, and the worst had not yet come. In the summer of 1944, Moran was transferred again. The journey took him across occupied Poland in a cattle car packed with 60 prisoners. There was no room to sit, no sanitation, no food for 3 days. Men collapsed against one another, standing only because there was nowhere to fall. Some prayed. Others simply stared at the wooden walls, waiting for the train to stop. The destination was one camp, then another. Over the following months, Moran passed through 4 different prisoner facilities as German authorities shuffled captives across their shrinking empire. Each transfer brought new guards, new rules, new diseases, and new ways to suffer. The worst came in the autumn of 1944. The Hell Ship. German officials decided to move several hundred Allied prisoners across the Baltic Sea. The vessel was an aging freighter, never designed to carry human cargo. Guards forced the prisoners down into the hold below deck, a dark metal chamber with no ventilation, no sanitation, and no space to move. Moran descended into that hold with 200 other men. The hatch slammed shut above them. The ship lurched forward, and the nightmare began. The hold was pitch black. Prisoners could not see their own hands. They could only hear the sounds, groaning, coughing, retching. Men with dysentery cried out as they failed to reach the single bucket designated as a latrine. Within hours, the stench became unbearable. The crossing lasted 4 days. Men died in that hold. Their bodies remained among the living because there was nowhere else to put them. Some prisoners lost their minds in the darkness and filth. They screamed. They fought. They prayed. Others simply went quiet and had to be checked for a pulse to see if they were still alive. When the hatch finally opened, Moran climbed out into gray daylight with eyes that had forgotten how to see. His clothes were soaked with filth. His body had lost weight it could not afford to lose. The metal plate in his skull throbbed with a deep, relentless pain. The Hell Ship delivered its surviving cargo to another camp in Prussia. More barbed wire, more guard towers, more thin soup and black bread, more waiting for a war that felt endless. But the war was ending. By January 1945, Soviet forces were advancing from the east. Allied armies were pushing in from the west. Germany was being crushed between 2 unstoppable fronts. Prisoners heard distant artillery. They watched guards grow nervous, jumpy, afraid. Something was coming. On February 6, 1945, it arrived. Soviet troops were approaching the camp. German commanders ordered an immediate evacuation. All prisoners were to march west on foot. Destination unknown. Duration unknown. Refusal meant execution. The prisoners assembled in the frozen compound. Temperatures had dropped to 20 degrees below zero. Many men had no winter coats, no gloves, no proper boots. They had survived on starvation rations for months. Now they were expected to walk across Germany during the coldest winter in decades. The column stretched for miles. Thousands of Allied airmen trudging through snow and ice. German guards marched alongside with rifles at the ready. Anyone who fell behind would be shot. Anyone who tried to escape would be shot. The message was simple: walk or die. Moran had survived a 4-mile fall from the sky. He had survived catastrophic injuries. He had survived crude surgery and raging infection. He had survived the Hell Ship. Now he faced 600 miles of frozen roads with a body that had never fully healed. The march would later be known as the Black March, one of the longest forced marches of Allied prisoners in European history. 86 days of walking through blizzards and freezing rain, sleeping in barns filled with animal waste, drinking from ditches contaminated with human sewage, eating whatever could be stolen or scavenged from the ruined countryside, and an estimated 1,500 American and British airmen died during the Black March. Pneumonia, dysentery, typhus, frostbite that turned into gangrene, bullets from guards who decided a straggler was not worth waiting for. Eugene Moran put one foot in front of the other and refused to stop. Behind him lay 17 months of captivity. Ahead lay an unknown number of miles through enemy territory. Somewhere beyond that, if he could survive long enough, was freedom. The Black March dragged on through February and March of 1945. Prisoners walked 15 to 20 miles each day through snow that sometimes rose to their knees. They slept in frozen barns or out in the open. They ate raw potatoes stolen from fields and drank melted snow because streams were foul with human waste. Moran's body protested every step. His arms had healed improperly and throbbed in the cold. The metal plate in his skull conducted freezing air straight into his head. His ribs had never fully recovered from the crash. Every breath of icy air reminded him of the injuries he had suffered 17 months earlier. Men died around him every day. Some collapsed in the snow and never stood up again. Others burned with fever and were gone within hours. Guards shot prisoners who could not keep pace. The column left a trail of bodies across the German countryside, grim markers of suffering and exhaustion. But Moran kept moving. He had not survived a 4-mile fall from the sky to die on a frozen road. He had not endured the hell ship to surrender to exhaustion. Something deep inside him refused to quit. The same stubborn resolve that kept him firing his guns as Rikki Tikki Tavi tore itself apart around him. By April, the column had covered nearly 500 miles. The prisoners could hear Allied artillery growing louder with each passing day. American and British forces were closing in from the west. Soviet armies were advancing from the east. Germany was collapsing. Liberation was coming. On April 26, 1945, the march ended. American soldiers from the 104th Infantry Division intercepted the column near the Elbe River. The German guards dropped their weapons and surrendered. The prisoners stood in stunned silence, barely able to comprehend what was happening. After years of captivity, after months of marching, after countless moments when death seemed inevitable, they were free. Moran weighed 93 pounds. He had entered the army at 150. The crash, the surgeries, the camps, the hell ship, and the march had stripped away nearly 40% of his body weight. He looked like a skeleton wrapped in skin, but he was alive. Medical teams rushed to treat the liberated prisoners. Many required immediate hospitalization. Typhus had spread through the column during the march. Pneumonia was rampant. Frostbite had claimed fingers and toes that would soon require amputation. Doctors worked around the clock to stabilize men who had been systematically starved and brutalized for months or years. As Moran's case was reviewed, Army officials grew increasingly astonished. His service record documented the impossible. Shot down over Bremen on November 29, 1943. Aircraft destroyed by enemy action. Fell from 24,000 feet inside a severed tail section without a functioning parachute. Survived impact. Captured by enemy forces. Held as a prisoner of war for 17 months. Survived a forced march of approximately 600 miles. Military historians would later confirm that only 3 Allied airmen in the entire Second World War survived falls of comparable distance without parachutes. Eugene Moran was one of them. The other 2 had lived only because pieces of wreckage slowed the descent just enough to make survival possible. All 3 cases were considered miraculous. The Army awarded Moran 2 Purple Hearts for the wounds he suffered during the attack on his bomber, 1 for each arm shattered by German cannon fire. He received the Air Medal with Oak Leaf Cluster for his service with the 8th Air Force, along with the European Theater Medal and the Good Conduct Medal. On December 1, 1945, he was honorably discharged. The 96th Bomb Group had lost 938 men during the war, 206 aircraft destroyed, thousands of missions flown over the most heavily defended targets in Europe. Moran's survival was a statistical anomaly within an organization defined by catastrophic loss. News of his fall had spread even during the war. Allied radio operators intercepted German broadcasts describing an American airman who fell for miles and lived. The story made its way back to Wisconsin, where Moran's family had spent months not knowing whether he was alive or dead. Anonymous letters arrived, repeating what had been heard over the airwaves. Hope mixed with uncertainty until official confirmation finally came. Staff Sergeant Eugene Moran returned to Soldiers Grove, Wisconsin in late 1945. The farm boy who once watched airplanes pass overhead and dreamed of flight. The tail gunner who fell from the sky and refused to die. He was 21 years old and he had aged decades. The question now was whether he could build a life after everything he had endured. A few months after returning home, Moran married Margaret Finley, a local woman who had known him before the war. She saw past the physical scars, the hollow eyes, and the nightmares that jolted him awake in the dark. She saw the man beneath the damage. Together, they built a life on a small farm near Soldiers Grove, the same land where Moran had once stood as a boy, watching aircraft trace lines across the sky. Those dreams of flight had been replaced by memories he could never fully escape. The roar of engines, the rattle of machine guns, the sound of aluminum tearing apart at 24,000 feet. Moran rarely spoke about the war. Not to his wife, not to his 9 children, not to anyone who asked. The memories were too painful, the losses too heavy. 8 of his crewmates had died aboard Rikki Tikki Tavi. Countless friends had perished in camps or on the march. To speak of it meant reliving it. So he remained silent for more than 60 years. The physical wounds never truly healed. The metal plate in his skull caused headaches for the rest of his life. His arms remained weak and sensitive to cold. His ribs ached when storms approached. His body carried the evidence of November 29th, 1943 until his final breath. But Moran lived. He raised his family. He worked his farm. He went to church on Sundays and watched his grandchildren grow. He outlived most of his fellow prisoners and nearly all of his fellow crew members. The farm boy who should have died a dozen times instead lived long enough to see the 21st century. In 2007, more than 6 decades after the war had ended, the Wisconsin Department of Veterans Affairs created a new honor, the Veteran Lifetime Achievement Award. Eugene Moran was chosen as its very first recipient. At last, officially, his home state acknowledged what he had endured and what he had survived. The ceremony drew renewed attention to his story. Journalists came to interview him. Historians began documenting his experiences in detail. A local teacher named John Brewster became deeply fascinated by Moran's life and began conducting long, in-depth interviews with him and his family. After 60 years of silence, the story finally began to emerge. Brewster spent years researching every aspect of it: military records, German archives, eyewitness accounts, and survivor testimony. That work eventually became a book titled Tailspin, published in 2022, a complete account of the farm boy who fell 4 miles and lived. On October 18, 2008, the town of Soldiers Grove honored Moran by naming a street after him, Eugene Moran Way, a permanent marker in the community where he was born, where he returned after the war, and where he spent the rest of his life. The other survivor from Rikki Tikki Tavi also made a home. Navigator Jesse Orson had managed to bail out of the forward section before the bomber broke apart. He spent the remainder of the war as a prisoner, alongside thousands of other Allied airmen. His testimony later confirmed Moran's account and helped solidify the historical record of that November morning over Bremen. Eugene Moran died on March 23, 2014. He was 89 years old. 7 decades had passed since German Flak cut his bomber in half and sent him tumbling 4 miles toward the earth. 7 decades since he kept firing his machine guns while the world spun violently around him. 7 decades since Serbian doctors saved his life with crude tools and extraordinary skill. His obituary noted that he lived by a simple philosophy: "I would rather wear out than rust out." Words that perfectly capture a man who refused to surrender to the Germans, to his injuries to the march, or to the long silence that followed. The tail gunner's position on a B-17 was the loneliest place on the aircraft. Isolated from the crew, the first target for enemy fighters, the last to know if the bomber was doomed. Eugene Moran occupied that position on November 29, 1943, and when his aircraft disintegrated around him, he did not curl up and wait for death. He kept shooting all the way down. If this story moved you the way it moved us, do me a favor and hit that like button. Every single like tells YouTube to share this story with more people. Subscribe and turn on notifications. We rescue forgotten stories from dusty archives every single day. Stories about tail gunners who fell from the sky, farm boys who refused to die, real people, real heroism. Drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from. Are you in the United States, the United Kingdom, Canada, Australia? Our community stretches across the entire world. You're not just a viewer. You're a part of keeping these memories alive. Tell us your location. Tell us if someone in your family served. Just let us know you're here. Thank you for watching, and thank you for making sure Eugene Moran does not disappear into silence. These men deserve to be remembered, and you are helping make that happen.